The judges were biased toward musical acts. Through an awareness of intersectionality, the careers of those complicit to cover up were blighted. The reforms threatened his autocratic power. A more progressive social policy, a populist leader, gave him a speculative glance.
Good afternoon, and welcome to the panel, The Many Faces of Fascism. A warm welcome to the conference of Transmediale 2018, Face Value, also, as this is our first auditorium panel. My name is Daphne Tragona, and I'm the conference curator of the festival. So, face value, an economic term really, referring to nominal value, a value that does not change, that is not affected by market fluctuations, but that is still necessary to estimate capital accumulation, a term that is associated to money, real estate, and also debt, but which more and more invokes the politics of life itself. A term which can be misread as the value of the face, in a period when we experience people being valued or devalued based on their color of their skin, their gender, or nationality. And this happens in a period of increasing confusion, when appearances deceive, when the language of xenophobia prevails, and many fractals and derivatives of sexism, racism, and fascism arise. As part of this year's conference, we aim to discuss the relation of neoliberalism to fascism, and to specifically examine the role of media in today's multiple and alarming formations. If fascism is a cancerous body, as McCarthy once wrote, how can the expansion of its faces, derivatives, and transformations be stopped? Our moderator for this panel is Diana McCarty, a media activist working on art, gender, and politics and technology, being especially interested in radical feminism. Diana is the founding editor of Reboot FM in Berlin, a co-founder of the Faces mailing list, and a founding member of the Radio FM network of cultural radios. In the 90s, as a cyberpunk, she was active in net culture, in different groups, lists, but also spaces. Diana was among the initiators of Nervous Systems, an exhibition organized in Hakave 2 years ago. Before leaving the stage to Diana and our speakers, I would like to mention that this panel is part of the new Network Normal project, realized with the support of the Creative Europe program. Thank you. Please welcome Diana and our speakers.
So thank you, Daphne, Christopher, and the Transmediale team. I just would start with saying that for somebody like me, who, as a cyberpunk, someone really active in critical nets, like the critical network, nets culture of the 90s, it's particularly difficult to see how the rise of a new right, but how implicated the media is in that. I think, unfortunately, this panel needs to happen, and I'm grateful to Transmediale for organizing this panel, because it's understanding how fascism works is important for everybody, but it's particularly important in the context of new media and media. And I think it's important for culture to take up questions of politics. Politics, like wherever you stand politically, fascism affects everybody, so it inhabits our daily lives, no matter where you stand within a political spectrum. The new right, which is rising everywhere around the world, actually does manifest itself in different forms of just how you go through your day. How it impacts you directly is perhaps something it can often be invisible, but things like xenophobia, racism, sexism, and a lot of things connected with heteronormative culture are the sort of trickle-down effect of really far-right agendas, and these things get normalized. So suddenly it's possible for people to speak in very openly racist terms in public spaces in a way that wasn't that normal just a few years ago. So this is something where I think it's important to understand that culture also plays a role in generating discourses and some kind of public, I don't like the word awareness, but understanding of how fascism operates. I have two little fascist, I guess, fun facts. One is with an admission that I learned this through watching American late-night comedy shows, in this case, The Opposition, where one of their journalists went to an alt-right citizen journalism school and learned that one of Steve Bannon, who is the founder of Breitbart, I think most people know who he is, his favorite film is Koyaanisqatsi by Godfrey Reggio, and that's, yeah. And okay, this is something which is super interesting because this film is used to teach alt-right citizen journalists. And I think that's sort of points to how culture is not innocent either. So it can be appropriated for other means. Of course, it was almost equally shocking to find out that within the alt-right movement, there's something called alt-feminism, which is an absolute contradiction in terms, but nevertheless it exists. And I think, of course, that's something that ought not to exist, and feminists have to get that back. That's partly, I think, a kind of vigilance that is needed in order to maintain and create, at least stand the ground that has been gained through other struggles. So, feminism being one of them. I want to just give a very short personal anecdote. My 10-year-old nephew came to visit me in Germany last year, and he actually thought I was friends with Angela Merkel because of the proximity of HKW to her office. But he did actually manage to, my sister and her husband took him. They went to Italy, Germany, France, Portugal, and Spain. And during our trip, we talked about some politics, and my nephew was absolutely convinced that Stalin was an awful, terrible person, and I was impressed that he knew the name. But I was even more, let's say, impressed that he didn't know the name of any fascist leaders. And this is part of how I think a kind of liberal, progressive agenda educates people about the evils of communism. And this is partly, it's very convenient, it's a convenient truth to leave out of a history that doesn't explore who fought against fascism in the past. And I think, I do have to mention somebody like Dennis Yücel, who's a German journalist that's being held, he's been charged with being a member of the PKK in Turkey. And he was recently, the German government tried to negotiate his release and used the threat of rescinding an arms deal with Turkey if Dennis Yücel is not released from prison. He himself stated, no, don't involve me in that. I don't want to be released based on an arms agreement. And I think this is the kind of vigilance that's needed in order to combat fascism and the side effects of right-wing agendas. I think that said, I would start the panel. And it's, I think it's, and again, I'm happy that happy is the wrong word. I'm glad that this discussion is taking place because it needs to take place. And we will start then with Rasmus Fleischer. He's here on the very extreme left to me. He's a Swedish historian and essayist. He works as a postdoctoral researcher at the Department of Economic History at Stockholm University, and he's in the project Streaming Heritage. His academic work is mostly located in the intersection of media history and the critique of political economy, and he has a particular focus on the commodification of music. He was previously a member of the Bureau for Piracy from 2003 to 2009, and he's been actually part of panels at Transmediale for years, and he's also, I think, a fellow, let's say, traveler in the 90s culture, and I think with that, we would hand you the mic.
Thank you. It was exactly 10 years ago on this day that I sat on this stage for the first time, and then I talked about the Pirate Bay, that famous BitTorrent tracker and symbol of file-sharing culture that had just been indicted by the Swedish state for assisting copyright infringement. So I guess I sat here and spoke as some kind of representative of the Pirate Bay, although I was not directly involved. So I was part of this group cooperating in internet activism, sometimes using the front page of the Pirate Bay to draw attention to our campaigns and pranks. Our identity was that of radical leftists, We kept some distance to the Pirate Party with their mixture of left-wing and right-wing libertarians. However, we could see a natural alliance between all kinds of libertarians to defend a free internet. So maybe some kind of cyber-libertarian alliance after all. And we were all opposed to those authoritarians who, among other things, wanted to control the flow of information. They were represented for us both by George W. Bush and his neoconservatives, by Vladimir Putin, by his friend, his Italian friend, Silvio Berlusconi, and of course by people like Ahmadinejad in Iran, and so on. We opposed them all in their attempts to shut down the digital infrastructure for free and decentralized communications. And as for the fascists and the national populists, they seemed even further away from us. They seemed to represent just another level of authoritarian control. And they still had not entered the Swedish parliament. So that was 10 years ago, and things have changed for sure. I very recently visited the Pirate Bay because I wanted to download some TV episode. I don't go there too frequently nowadays, and I also must be careful to close the tab immediately because otherwise JavaScripts will hijack all the processing power of my computer to mine some cryptocurrency. Let me add that I don't know who's running the Pirate Bay today, but it's not the same group as 10 years ago. So this time I stopped to look at it because I saw something was changing on the front page. Just like in the pranks we used to do, the logo was exchanged for another image. It sure looked like a prank, featuring the image of a guy surrounded by a pentagram and some Hebrew letters. I clicked on it and was filled with disgust as I arrived at a YouTube video with national populist and anti-feminist propaganda, featuring a row of well-known alt-right codes, including those references to Jewishness serving no rhetorical purpose except being open to interpretation as either anti-Semitic or philo-Semitic. The young man talking in the video looked like a stereotypical young hacker guy of the type like you would find in a pirate party. And he called himself a nihilist. Apparently, he is a minor star on the Swedish alt-right scene. He's using his own immigrant background to impersonate an outsider perspective on Sweden. The country is supposedly taken over by a crazy elite of feminists, using immigration to somehow further their own economic interest at the cost of ordinary working-class Swedes. Paradoxically, he really spoke as a warrior for social justice, while at the same time preaching resistance to those called social justice warriors. A large part of his rant was also dedicated to the critique of social media companies like Google and Facebook, who, according to him, designed their algorithms to downrate those who dare telling the truth. So, this rant that was promoted by the Pirate Bay ends with this YouTuber expressing his hope that another YouTuber will come and save Sweden. This other YouTuber was PewDiePie, with a very large guy with millions of followers who is red-pilled, as they say, because he's been making anti-Semitic remarks. So if just he will speak out for the Sweden Democrats before the elections in September, then Sweden will be saved. That was like the message we get to the visitors of the Pirate Bay. And seeing this transformation of the Pirate Bay into a propaganda outlet for the Sweden Democrats was quite shocking. And it was also a bit shocking to see how nobody in Sweden seemed to care about it. After all, there has already been examples of high-profile cyber-libertarians turning towards the populist right, including the founder of the Pirate Party, who was right-wing all along, but at some point decided for this change of alliance from having an alliance between left and right-wing libertarians to a right-wing alliance between libertarians and national conservatives. Probably we were never very naive 10 years ago when we could not imagine such a mutation. And then came WikiLeaks and that whole disaster known as Assange, who accused Sweden of being the Saudi Arabia of feminism. This certainly drew some of the male cyber-libertarians towards a more aggressive anti-feminism. We also have examples outside of Sweden, like in the Netherlands, where like the most part of the leadership of the Pirate Party quit in order to join Thierry Baudet's new far-right party. And we can see, like in Germany, how identitarian fascists are reenacting the pirate rhetoric of Stasi 2.0 when they protest new laws to control hate speech on social media. So all this gives some things to think about. Well, there is this saying often attributed to Walter Benjamin that every rise of fascism bears witness to a failed revolution. So then we can ask, what does it? What does the current situation tell us? To what is then contemporary fascism a reaction? What was that revolution that did not take place then? Classical fascism was born almost 100 years ago, and that was indeed a reaction to the failed revolutions of 1917 and early 20s. But today, if you look at today's fascism, there are several possible answers. We have, of course, one dominant far-right narrative that this is a right-wing revolt against that they call 1968, which is quite close to the interpretation that it is actually mostly a revolt against feminism. I think there is much to that. Then, on the other hand, we see those mutations recently driven by online subcultures and memes that, according, for example, Angela Nagel in Kill All Normies, means that the alt-right of today is rather the inheritors of 1968. So it's a paradoxical picture. Then, at the same time, we must, as I indicated, consider the fate of what we could call the digital revolution, and whatever kind of failure that was. And here I can also recall the theme of Transmediale 4 years ago: the revolution is over. So, can it somehow be that today's fascism is connected at some level to the failure of some kind of to the failure of a digital revolution? And then finally, of course, we must see it in the context of the global financial crisis and the wave of protests and failing protests culminating in 2011, and how that relates to the current explosion of political paranoia. How much time do I left? Okay, great. So, I have previously written a little bit about the possibility of identifying today in Europe not one fascism, but several fascisms. That was after the massacre in Norway by Anders Behring Breivik. And I was disturbed by the superficial observation that was expressed by many people, that fascists today are either anti-Semitic or anti-Islam, when in reality that is much more interconnected and it's not either or. So instead I try to distinguish between two ideal types of fascism in Europe today, where one tendency was more presented themselves as the defenders of Western civilization against the barbarians outside, while the other tendency were dedicated to ethno-pluralist ideas and of every people's right to self-determination, more in line with some old-school anti-imperialist rhetoric. Anyway, I soon had to revise many of those observations. They don't hold anymore. And I think partly it has to do that the Iraq war was at that time still in fresher memory, and the neoconservatism of George W. Bush was still a dividing factor on the right, more than it is today. But it also has to do with this semiotic complexity that we see in how those movements are expressing themselves today. And I hope that Saturday's panel about the politics of transgression with Florian Kramer and Angela Nagel will clarify parts of that, maybe. So anyway, even though we can identify like distinct fascism, or say a number for how many fascism we have, it is today commonplace that one far-right group tries to position itself against another far-right group and insinuate that the other one is fascist. And we also see all the time how like one fascist claims that the other fascist is part of a globalist plot. Just like after this massacre in Norway, when, for example, some of the Nazi groups in Europe immediately rushed to say that Anders Behring Breivik is like really controlled by the Jews. So at the surface, such a narcissism of minor differences may resemble just a sectarianism of the post-1968 left, which is, of course, also a movement from which the new right's cultural warriors have learned a lot of lessons. But it also results in a climate of confusion that becomes really problematic and feeds the climate of paranoia in which fascist movements thrive. So we have a kind of pattern in which fascists now try to position themselves as the anti-authoritarians, including like critique of censorship in social media and so on. And they systematically try to accuse leftists of being authoritarian, or even of being the real fascists. So I don't know how to end, but maybe we can ask how meaningful it is in that context to cultivate a collective identity based on the label of "we are the anti-fascists." It even brings to thought the comment by Amadeo Bodiga, the leader of the Italian communist left, that anti-fascism is the worst product of fascism. That's, of course, a bit problematic too, but maybe we can say that the commitment to oppose fascism by all means, to always support the less evil alternative, or the alternative that seems less evil, that's definitely not satisfactory and may blind us to the other phases of fascism that emerge at the same time. Thank you.
So thank you, Rasmus. That was really, I think, helpful. I would like to say, if you have an urgent question that directly addresses the talk that Rasmus just gave, please, we'll have space for 1 or 2 questions right now. Otherwise, we would save it for the end of the panel when we have panelist discussion and then open it up to the public. Okay, it looks like we will just move on. I'm very pleased to, I would have a lot of questions, but yeah, I was lucky enough to be called by the AfD an Linksfaschisten and Antidemokraten, but that was fun. So. So I'm really delighted to introduce Eva Majewska, here to my left. She's also to my extreme left, I think. Maybe not to the extreme left of me, but... Eva Majewska is a feminist philosopher of culture, and I have to say I'm extremely delighted because she is an eminent feminist philosopher of culture. And there aren't that many, but there should be more. So if you're looking for a new job title in a field of work, She works as an adjunct professor at the Department of Artes Liberales at the University of Warsaw. She was a visiting fellow at the University of California, Berkeley, and she was a stipendiate fellow at the University of Örebro, Sweden, at the IWM in Vienna, and here at the ICI Berlin. She is the author of 3 monographs, co-editor of 4 volumes on neoliberalism, politics, gender, and education, and she publishes articles and essays in journals like eFlux, Nowa Krista, several Polish cultural magazines and publications that I'm not going to mispronounce publicly here. She has also written for Le Monde Diplomatique and multiple collected volumes. Her main focus is weak resistance, counterpublics, and critical effect studies. And I think with that, I would hand the mic to Eva. So
thank you
wonderful
very
to have
much
you here.
for this generous presentation, and thank you all for coming here on this beautiful Saturday afternoon. I'm delighted to be here and to talk about this highly unpleasant topic. Also because coming from Warsaw, somehow I feel strange. I feel this estrangement with this thing that I would like to begin with, which is we have fascists in Warsaw. I think we should think about this sentence and what it means, because I never thought I would have to say something like that, honestly. I mean, living in Warsaw means that on every corner you cross a little plaque saying how many people were killed during the Second World War. In Warsaw, we couldn't have Occupy Warsaw, because look at the sound of it. It's like a little bit like Occupy Palestine. Yeah? Would you make a movement like that? I'm not sure. Yeah. So basically, my position or my sort of the context I come from and the place I live in makes me a kind of a peculiar discussant in a discussion about fascism. On one hand, because it's extremely emotional and very life-connected, sort of life experience-connected topic. On the other hand, it's because living in Warsaw, to me, means a responsibility. This responsibility of never again. And I believe that a lot of you and a lot of people living in Germany and other places also, have this claim in their minds and in their lives, which I'm super grateful for. But living in Warsaw means crossing the border of the Warsaw Ghetto. It's marked, yeah, on the pavement. So when you walk in Warsaw, every now and then you can, cross this strange little metal kind of line, and then it says that the ghetto used to be there. Living in Warsaw means that you exactly that you cannot have an Occupy Warsaw movement. So when everybody is doing the Occupy, you're continuing alter globalism or something. By the way, a little remark on what Rasmus just said. You asked this wonderful question: which revolution didn't happen since we have fascism? I was thinking of alter globalism, actually. So I'm just throwing it briefly. But I think this is the revolution that had all the chances to be really transformative, transversal, effective, and which was tamed with cruelty and efforts from all kinds of police institutions that you cannot imagine. But I was supposed to speak about Faces of Fascism and Poland and examples from where I come from, and also weak resistance and counter public. So I will try to do that. Please remind me of time, because I have a tendency of not. I suffer from dyschronia, yeah? So this disease that makes the relation with time a little bit peculiar. So to me, the faces of fascism I know and I experience now in Poland especially, but I believe our experience, so I'll try to talk about Poland in ways that allow to take this specific example a bit further and to look at the more global tendencies via the lens of the Polish one. So in Poland, it seems like we have a state of exception, actually. Sorry for this Agambenian note. I know that not everybody is perhaps comfortable with the Homo Sacer theory and its author, but anyways, I think it's sort of right to say that we have a state of exception in a sense that our juridical system has been blocked on several levels. So starting with the Supreme Court and Constitutional Court, we have all the levels of juridical system blocked and dominated by the ruling government and ruling party. We have so our courts will be organized directly by Minister of Justice. So the executive. So this is one example of the many changes that have happened in the Polish country right now on the level of law and institutions, which makes our country a country where the executive power is overwhelmingly present. So this is why I call it a state of exception. I think it's technically right, and a lot of lawyers use this term, so I'm not... yeah, but this is actually one of the advisors of the former, so the brother of the, there were two Kaczyńskis, right? Now there is one. So the chief of the leading party, Prawo i Sprawiedliwość, the Law and Justice Party, Jarosław Kaczyński, used to employ as his counselor the translator of Carl Schmitt, and a professor of political philosophy who is extremely fond of Schmitt from the conservative perspective. So this man was working has been working around the Polish government and Polish presidential office since 12 years now. So you see that there are direct links between the Schmittian state of exception doctrine and our applied political doctrine. So this is not funny anymore at all. We have also we have experienced the taking over of the media. So the ruling government basically fired every journalist that could cause any problems whatsoever from the public media. And currently our public media are actually fascist media. I'm not afraid to say it. It's really the message that is on daily basis delivered by the public media is a message supporting the most controversial fascist tendencies. Also, you might have heard of the big protests of women in Poland. This is the most exciting part of it. So this is the only protest that had any effect. Basically, we still have certain tiny little possibility to terminate pregnancies in Poland. We were threatened that we wouldn't. But after the protests of last year, which involved some 150,000 of people in different countries, in different cities and villages in Poland, so after this huge wave of protests, including the women's strike and including the huge protest on social media, several versions of them, I will go into them later because I think in the transmediale this might be quite interesting to look at social media as an entity that does not capture and block the protest, but that actually has been used by the protest. I think it's quite a nice little victory over the machine of social media as we know it. So the women's protests, which in Poland they were called the black protests, because the protesters were using the black color, usually, the clothes. Yeah? So this is why we have, so if you hear about the black protests in Poland, it doesn't have any racial connotation at all, but it's the protests of women against the efforts to ban abortion completely, yeah? So reproductive rights and women's rights protests. But the more important fascist element of our public debates and atmosphere in Poland and institutional changes has been the anti-women narrative that has been explored in Poland since, I would say, 2013-14, peaking in 2016 with efforts and joining the efforts of the ruling party to ban abortion completely, but also to ban any medical examination of the fetus while pregnancies, etc., etc. So they are demanding that women give birth to, that women continue pregnancies that are condemned to be over because of medical reasons, right? So it's not just that they enforce women to give birth to children, but they enforce women to give birth to whatever they have in their womb. Yeah? So that's the dramatic. So we are in 21st century. Medicine is ready to, support people with their reproductive plans and programs, and still we are pushed towards a situation where women have no decision whatsoever over what happens to her body, yeah? Regardless of any cost. So regardless whether it's resulting of rape, regardless whether it's a risk for the mother's life, regardless whether the fetus is developing properly, and at all, so the access to abortion might become completely impossible. And this, I would like all of us to think about the brutality of it, yeah? Because I think that as an element, to me, this anti-women's politics and the whole discourse transforming us, so human beings into and citizens of a country, into objects of biological and ideological manipulation, is depriving us of any humanity, basically, of any rights, any agency as well. And this discourse is an element of a more general framework of heroic political narrative heroic political agency, which I'm very much against. So what I mean by this? By this, I mean that this state of exception kind of construction, as we have it now in Poland, inspired by Schmidt, but with some local, additions to it, it combines, it demands every Polish citizen to be heroic. So from men, it demands to fight for their country. We have a tremendous revitalization of historical narrative of bravery. And so, as you probably know, most of the Polish uprisings, except for Solidarność movement in 1980, failed with great costs. So, for instance, during the Second World War, we had the Warsaw uprising where 200,000 of people were killed over 2 months. And the ruling party is making of this a heroic moment. So in our schools, children learn that they should be like the uprisers, basically. So basically, men are prepared to this role of, so we have basically a backlash of gender roles towards the most traditional visions of them. So boys are taught to be heroic, brave, etc. We don't have any war yet in Poland, right? But still everybody is being involved in the narrative of we would defend our country, we would be like the Warsaw uprisers, whatever. And on the other hand, from women, the same sort of, mirror reflection of this, of similar heroism is requested, since they are forced to give birth at whatever cost, right? So you have a perfect symmetry of heroic demands from our government. So obviously, if you are a critical and resistant sort of thinker and activist, you think of a strategy of opposing to that complex. And obviously weak resistance comes to mind. So although this very idea of weak resistance has been coined by me, by Rossi Barozzi and by Walid Erhouri here at the ICI 2 years ago, while we were thinking of resistances to neoliberalism, that involve these non-heroic sort of forms of agency. In the Polish context of contemporary politics and contemporary situation, I would see the weak resistance, first of all, as a rejection, opposition, but also rejection, and perhaps also alternative to this highly heroic, extremely fascist mode of subjectivity that is enforced on us today by our government and institutions and educational structures as well. Yeah? So, okay, so very briefly, I'll go to the end. So since I mentioned the counterpublics, I would like to mention this women's protests that happened throughout Poland as a form of subaltern counterpublics, as a form of weak resistance, because they were based in, they were basically extremely transversal. So this movement was using super simple strategies of women's marches, but also of sending pictures to social media in support of women's rights, and therefore building a certain media support for the cause. Actually, what happened was that at first, in September 2016, we had this action of collecting photographs in support of particular women and groups, in support of the women's protests. And then 2 weeks later, women took it to the streets. So since, so to me and to other scholars, sociologists and cultural studies scholars, this moment of using the social media in order to support the women's cause was a moment of sort of initiation into the political realm. So a lot of women said later, many women said later, sorry, that without this online actions, they would never participate in any protest because they have never been political activists, they have no idea what to... So the social media played a tremendous role for that, but also this counterpublic was using extremely simple economy-based sort of argumentation, and abortion and reproductive rights have been discussed not solely in this liberal framework of choice. And I think this is an extremely important element. So first time in our lives, I think, the massive protests of women in favor of reproductive rights left the liberal narrative of choice and individual subjectivity, and we were talking about ourselves as a community. So all ages of women were there, and we were talking of women as a multitude rather than segregated groups of women. So this is the most important. But this was possible also because this kind of class binaries and class borders that make certain people be capable to choose abortion or not, and certain other people, the poor population, it's not possible to have an abortion in Poland if you are a poor person. You just cannot buy it, basically. Because abortion is obviously accessible everywhere. Only you have to pay for it, right? So abortion in Poland is extremely economic topic. So the narrative of choice is hiding this economic aspect of abortion, and therefore is sort of further ideologizing the situation. So the black protests in 2016 and 17 got rid of the choice narrative, and we started to talk about our bodies, our resistance to the fascist regime, our responsibilities also to ourselves, to the future generations. So the abortion narrative has been connected with ecology, anti-capitalism, and all other anti-authoritarianism and other forms of resistance. So it was beautiful. So in this sense, I think. And also, there were some people who were extremely famous, like Christina Yonder, an actress who played in Vaida's films, and she's extremely prominent. So she actually called us to make a women's strike. So it was her who publicly used the words women's strike, so then we did. But also in small cities, in bigger cities, the people who were taking the voice, talking publicly, organizing the demonstrations, were very often people who have never been active politically. So to me, this was a beautiful sort of awakening of women as a political subject. So I'll end with the fact that although our government, and similarly to American government and other governments probably, try to treat women, deprive women of whatever political agency we have, this Polish example shows how powerful we can become as a counterpublic, so as an opposition to the running government, but also in a certain way as an opposition to the current elites, intellectual, cultural, the liberal elites, basically. And this perhaps will be the notes that I will stop on. Thank you very much. Thank you.
So yeah, thank you, Eva. And again, if anybody has an urgent question they'd like to address to Eva Majewska, please, I can't see the public very well. Otherwise, we'll leave it for the closing discussion. Good. Okay, so I'm going to move on to the final participant here to my left, and that's Alex Foti. And Alex is the author of General Theory of the Precariat, Great Recession, Revolution, Reaction, published by the Institute of Network Cultures just last year in 2017. He has been a political activist since 1999, when he started focusing on the self-organization of precarious workers in Europe and the socioeconomic consequences of growing precarity in advanced capitalism. He was among the founders of the Euro Mayday network, which federated anti-globalization movements around the precariat in many EU cities in the mid-2000s. He edited the Precarity issue in 2004 of Green Pepper magazine, which arguably initiated English language interest in the subject. And he wrote, Arguably. He wrote the entry Euro Mayday for the International Encyclopedia of Revolution and Protest, published by Blackwell in 2009, and his essay, The Precariat for Itself, Euro Mayday and Precarious Workers Movements, was included in Mapping Precariousness, Labor Insecurity and Uncertain Livelihoods, edited by several people who's Armano, Bove, Murgia, and published by Routledge in 2017. I just realized I'm not going to say E, okay. So I think with that, I would turn the mic to you. And thank you.
Yeah, of course, I mean, the length of the curriculum is inversely proportional to the level of preparation of the speakers. So, I mean, I had to drop like the few little things I'd done. And yes, of course, I mean, precarity and the precariat as concepts for activism, but also in mainstream culture, were the byproducts of fertile five decade of activism in the early 2000s that involved Berlin, Milan, Helsinki, and a host of other several cities, Barcelona, Madrid, Lisbon, and also Osaka, Toronto, that basically put forward the self-organization of temps, part-timers, care workers, fast food workers, teachers, precarious teachers, adjuncts, say, as a way to fight back neoliberalism. It was a strand of the anti-globalization movement, and with my book, like 10 years later after the fact, 10 years after Rostock, if you want, I wanted to pin down some developments that we had developed together with Spaniards, French, German activists in our common actions in Brussels, and Liège also was one of the major epicenters. Also because in the meantime, Guy Standing, a sociologist at SOAS, had published The Precariat, which had gotten a big popularity, so much that he also was invited at Davos last year to speak about the Precariat. And also, like in the New York Times crossword puzzles, the Precariat was a word, and so, you know, your Google translator doesn't correct you when you write Precariat, it's a word. Okay, so, but the point being that Standing didn't get it right. He didn't speak about millennials and, or if you wish, Generation X, Y, Z as being the main victims of neoliberal precarization. He didn't see the continuity between radical agency, saying the 2011 revolutions or failed revolutions, I'm a bit skeptical about that, were animated by precarious strata. Who were the first people that occupied that soil? It was, you know, unemployed students, precarious, unemployed people, young, precarious young people. I mean, Podemos and other, or En Comú in Barcelona are animated by young women who have part-time jobs and temporary jobs. I mean, it's like the new social condition of a large section of society. Around 20% of employees work short-time contracts, and the vast majority of people that are hired. So I really needed to pin down in sociological terms what the Precariat was, and that's why I wrote this book, and which for the first part is basically devoted to the class stratification of the Precariat. So, I mean, for example, this is the Precariat set, so it's a Euler-Venn set. So basically what it says is the Precariat is the intersection between part-timers and temps, supplemented by freelancers and students and needs being appendages, in the sense that students they have to do precarious jobs or internships, interns being the biggest constituency in this fact, and needs never had a job, so they're precarious for lives. And of course, a precarious person is half of the time unemployed, is a quantum worker. There is an entanglement of employment and unemployment in its condition. Okay, so if I can show the slide, okay, great. It's already been there forever, I don't know. But anyway, I have it in front of me. And so, basically, I wanted to, this is a very rough model of contemporary class stratification after Trump took power, and the split between the financial elites and the political elites, which effectively decreed the political end of neoliberalism in 2016, because when, you know, America and England, like, how to say, the brain of neoliberalism was removed, so to speak, so that geopolitically and ideologically neoliberalism is no longer there. It's an empty seat, so to speak, in my opinion. But anyway, so what's the stratification today? The financial elite, the top 1%, we used to say, right? You know them, I mean, Jeff Bezos, Mark Zuckerberg, or, you know, the Omaha guys and stuff. But below that, there is the office salariat. This is the shrinking middle class. The Guy Standing sees as the precariat, so the downwardly mobile. These people still are stuck with the neoliberal consensus. So to speak, they are the forces that would support GroKo in Germany. They're the forces that voted for Macron in France. So that they are behind a project of neoliberal restoration in regional terms. Regional mean continental. So since, I mean, in Anglo-Saxon countries, neoliberalism has been shelved, Europe has to salvage it for the interest of the bankers of Frankfurt and so on and so forth. Then there is the petty bourgeoisie, who's the major force, and this is a continuity between old and new fascism. I mean, between AfD or Lega in Italy, Front National, and on. I mean, Poulantzas, the Marxist theoretician, that most definitely identified this class basis of fascism. I mean, and we can also add a huge chunk of the white working class. And so I think this confronts us with the fact that while the Precariat is multi-ethnic, multi-gendered, and left-leaning, I mean, the working class, that used to be the revolutionary agent, has in fact gone right-wing, xenophobic, and male chauvinistic. And I don't think Marxists have really taken the consequence. So, I mean, socialists and communists are not going to like so much my book, because it kind of poses like a new ideological shift that's needed towards, you know, anarchism, environmentalism, and most especially feminism, to fuse a new ideological project that is capable of fighting national populism, Nazi populism. In depressions like this one, ideological power becomes paramount. And I'm citing, for example, Michael Mann. And the left lacks ideological power, guys. I mean, it's tied to old idols, communist revolutions that have failed the people hundreds of times over. Okay, Stalingrad was a much needed victory, but then again, it's not enough to rescue Stalinism from its failure. And I mean, what's most important is the failure of European social democracy. I mean, Sweden is the last country with Portugal to still have a socialist-leaning center-left government. Anywhere else, it's like a centrist forces that have squarely defeated the Social Democrats. And then we come to the two revolutionary classes, the service precariat, that's you, me, the young one, the millennials. I mean, there is a good book that you should read, Kids These Days, published by Malcolm Harris, a guy who was born in 1988. It's reviewed in Dissent. That it speaks about the precarization of and the delusion of people that invested years of their lives into left sides after the Great Reset. Underclass, the agent of riots, but still also you can see it in Italy. Sorry. The underclass, you can see in Italy, if you see soccer hooligans, say, you know, in Graz, in Liège, in Marseille, they're left-wing, Antifa, Antira. But if you go, in most soccer stadiums, hooligans are right-wingers. Okay, so, I argue that as like National Socialism was a perversion of social democracy, of socialism. I mean, national populism or Nazi populism is a perversion of, you know, of the anarcho-populism, if you wish, of 2011. Okay. Also, though, and this I think it's crucial because I fought neoliberalism most of my life, but now I realize that the target has changed in the fact that, you know, neoliberalism, even if in its neocon stage, was international. I mean, neoliberalism was global. Here, instead, we are like seeing closed borders. We're seeing a massive manipulation of emotion and irrationality. That's again like another parallelism with historical fascism. So, I mean, what are the antidotes to how you say, Nazi populism? I would say clearly anti-capitalism or decapitalism, we learned yesterday. So in the sense that left-wing movements have sedimented practices, repertoires. So, I mean, these are mostly what's been sedimented since Seattle and Tahrir, if you wish, okay, just to be. So, anarcho-autonomist, anarcho-feminist, anarcho-green, anarcho-feminist most especially, feminist strike being the social strike being another important struggle also in Poland. And anarcho-syndicalist. I mean, my contribution is clearly some kind of, informationalist, syndicalist contribution to organize the Precariat as a class in an intersectional alliance with, women's agency and immigrants' agency. I mean, this also, and queer subjectivity. It has also been the core of the Euromedei project a decade ago. But so if, okay, if I have 120 seconds, this is the final table. And Daphne predicted I would go long. Fuck, I'm sorry I did that. Anyway, so ecofeminist social populism. I call it social populism, and it's embodied in, neo-municipalist practices and all. So you can read it by yourself, but I want to especially underline the fact that, Nazi populism is really based on fossil capitalism. It's an ecocidal form, more, and in a way so that, climate justice, gender justice, and inequality in the economic sense, I mean, I refer a lot to Piketty, my work, are crucial to win this fight. Fascism prevailed because the elites handed power to them. This is less of a danger today. But it's more diffused in society. It's a silent majority type of phenomenon. I thank you. I hope I conveyed my opinions in a productive way. Grazie.
So yeah, thank you, Alex. Okay, do we have any pressing questions for Mr. Foti? Okay, I'm going to just move in directly to a question for all three of you, and that is one of the questions is what was the revolution that sort of fostered, or that this current rise of fascism is in relation to, or responding to. I would like to posit then the end of history as this revolution, and basically culminating in '89, after, basically when you start to see the phasing out of civil rights struggles, anti-colonial struggles, and different revolutionary struggles around the world. You have then '89, which could be considered, and which is parallel to the end of history, which was whatever his name is, and I forget on purpose.
Old France. I actually enjoy you forgetting that.
So we can forget some things. We can forget who wrote the end of history. It was wrong. But this is exactly in the moment of '89, which is also a win, let's say a perceived win of neoliberal capitalism / perceptions of what democracy is over communism. And I think that might be the revolution that, because now, the millennials, sort of, since '89, we've been living under, turbo capitalism, hyper neoliberal, capitalism that is, very politically driven, very ideologically driven. And so this, I would like to posit this as a potential, space for this new fascism to respond to or come out of. And then maybe, can we start with that? And then maybe go into this idea of neoliberalism being dead, because I would argue against that. So we're gonna stick to the order, okay? So I'm gonna ask Rasmus, then Eva, and then Alex to respond. Can we do that?
Right. Okay, where to begin? Maybe I have to think a bit about this end of history part. I think it makes much sense, and just like you said, Eva, that the alter globalization movement as a very important part of this historical constellation we're sketching up now. And just to add one more thing without answering the question, I think also your brief remarks, Alex, about ecology and the climate crisis. I'm not still sure about how to think that into this, but I somehow think it's highly relevant to understand also the rise of fascism as part of some attempt to just repress the feeling that the earth is being fucked up.
Okay, so I would like to start with something that Alex said by the end of your talk, that the elites handed power to the fascists. I think they usually do, so that's a very correct statement now and before and probably after. And in this sense, trying to answer the question, which is extremely large, but I think quite correct in a sense that it ties the current rise of fascism with a certain failure of communism as a project, right? So there are some controversies to me about that, because I'm not sure if 1989 was actually the failure of communism, whether this failure didn't begin earlier on with the measures and the strategies with which the USSR and generally the East Bloc sort of governed itself. Coming from Poland, I sort of vaguely remember the 1980, so the beginnings of the Solidarność movement, and this moment when, you know, we were joking that, because daily press in the communist Poland was Tribuna Ludu, so the Tribune of the People, and it had this subtitle saying, workers of the world unite, right? And then suddenly they did unite, and they did unite sort of in opposition to the communist government, but without demanding to reject the socialist system, the socialist political doctrine. So 1980 was the beginning of the Solidarność movement, which you probably know as the forefront of neoliberal changes in 1989. When this movement was born in 1980, it began as a counter-publics, I would say, in Kluge's sense. So in factories, you know, workers were creating public sphere based on experiences of production. You coming from Italy should like it very much, I think, as a project. So Negri wouldn't believe it. You know, we were trying to persuade him that this is what it actually was. It was very difficult to. I know, but it's interesting how these beginnings of Solidarność as a workers' movement directed not at overthrowing the socialist state, but directed at projecting different strategies of management that would be more horizontal and more democratic. So how this movement transformed itself into a sort of forefront of neoliberalism, this remains to be seen. But these beginnings and the ease with which we forgot these beginnings is important. But also, I don't know, I mean, from the left-wing perspective, I'm going to quote somebody who should be known here very well, Rosa Luxemburg, who said that, you know, there is so much, that she is very much against dwelling in the disappointment. Yeah, she's so unhappy always when people on the left are disappointed because of failure. So what she says is that we're going to fail, obviously. Like nobody tries to do what we did. Nobody knows how to do it, etc., etc. And I think today with these fascist waves of different kinds, but I think constituting one huge sort of ocean of fascism, I'm sorry to say, we're going to fail in spectacular ways, basically, because we're going to fail in our diagnosis of fascism. We're going to spend hours, for instance, or days or years discussing whether it's neo-fascism, post-fascism, for instance. But we're also going to try to produce political entities to undermine and to contradict different forms of fascist politics, and we're going to fail in that. Why? Because, not solely because of 1989, although it was important, but because the elites handed power to fascists. As simple as that. So there are elites, there are fascists, and there are us. And I think moving in this triangle could push us, and some people in Poland and elsewhere, we try to go back to the former left, so the left that has been there already. This is impossible. We cannot do it. We can be tremendously inspired by all kinds of left-wing organizations, patterns, and politics, but we cannot repeat them because history doesn't repeat itself. I mean, as farce, yes, but not in other ways. Okay.
I mean, one major cause of the second rise of fascism, because we saw it in the 80s, the first, right, I mean, this mortal danger now, it's clearly the Great Recession. The Great Depression, I mean, you cannot explain the rise of National Socialism in Germany without the Great Depression, and you cannot explain the rise to power of Trump in the United States without the consequences of the economic dislocations of the Great Recessions. I mean, people have never recovered the jobs they had. I mean, the financial markets have recovered, but the people have not recovered. And so, I mean, to build coalitions, it's a lot more work than to give people easy answer, face value answer, scapegoating immigrants for, austerity and cuts. So this is clear. I think like about 89, 2008, 16 were really the birth and evolution of, the rise and fall of the neoliberal ideology. I mean, in this book, I trace the origins, of course, in Milton Friedman's reaction, in Reagan's reaction against the so-called excesses of Keynesianism. But in my opinion, Trump is completely different than Reagan. Okay, just to be, Charlottesville would have been unthinkable even under Bush Jr. So I think there is really a switch there, and an end of the regime, because really, the Washington consensus was really about New York and London being the prime financial marketplaces, integrating and dictating through IMF, World Bank policies all over the world. And this has signally failed, and neoliberals, in order to remain in power, are changing tactics. They're not selling cuts, perhaps with the exception of the Tories who they have a death wish, luckily so. And this is my thing. It's clearly, again, a continental thing. And also that affects the Visegrad countries, like in the interwar period, and, again, Italy, Germany, and France. And in the reaction to Barcelona, we see Franco is ghost again. Whereas I see Northwestern Europe more immune. What's most noticeable, and I close here, is that after the Great Depression, America moved left and allied with Stalin to defeat the National Socialism. But today, instead, we have America moving right and supporting authoritarianism all over the world. So that's different.
Yeah, thanks. I want to go back to something which is the rise of basically, let's say, the right wing as an extremely white masculinist and white supremacist heteronormative thing that relies on something like family values at stake within some kind of defense of Western tradition, Western culture, which is, for me, even more ironic because actually, the history of Enlightenment is what brought us to actually communism, anarchism, a lot of the sort of more progressive ideas that happened in the last century arose out of this great Western tradition of the Enlightenment. And so these, to defend the Western tradition, one would actually defend something about education, something about facts. And so this is, for me, the ironic twist, is that in the time that through media we have, potentially, we as a people, young people, everyone has more access to information, but seem less interested in actual information, history, and facts, and so on. And the sort of slow and methodical takeover by right-wing states, not just in Poland, Hungary is quite similar to the US, is similar to Turkey, where basically it's been a very slow, methodical takeover of the judiciary, education systems, the media, and so on. So these things are not happening, they are happening within a bubble, but not within a vacuum. And this is something where, these things, in spite, I would call this a kind of not an opposition, but contrary to the weak resistance, this perhaps co-opting of the right of slow revolution, and that they've been building this up for a very long time. And so how economy works, because this is something I would like to go first to this, and then maybe to your proposal of the end of neoliberalism, because I'm not so sure, but I think the perceptions matter a lot, and how these things are understood by people are quite different from how they actually function. So first, actually, maybe it's not that important, the Enlightenment. For me, that's an interesting twist of fate, because, for example, when you talk about how to align, who do you align yourself with, right? Coming out of this sort of critical net culture, and that suddenly it's taken over by, fascists, or the rise of the women's movement, or even the rise of different political groups. It's what's lacking is a political consciousness and a class consciousness. And that's something which I think that's also what disappeared after '89 is class consciousness. So, sorry, please just, I am gonna stick, no, I'll go, yeah, if you need to.
Clearly there is a shift from industrialism to informationalism. So the working class is dead because I mean, like technological developments superseded, and also politically, he was defeated in the 80s in big struggles in Germany, Italy, okay, whatever. But I think it's important to understand that, I mean, the Fordist compromise was imposed by the American and French working classes and then by the whole Western working classes and their elites. And I think now, I mean, although I'm a revolution, I really think that since Great Depressions favor reactionary responses, I think that there is a radical reformist option out of this. Actually, I think it's the only one. So in the sense that, given the fact that, you know, liberal elites are scared of fascism, they're willing, we can force them into a social compromise based, in my opinion, on basic income, climate justice, urban liberation, municipalism, and whatnot. In the sense that, you know, Silicon Valley wants basic income. What do you make of that? Tony Negri says, I mean, this is the signal defeat of neoliberalism and a sense to find a new social legitimacy for, so to speak, the Jobsian paradigm. Okay, sorry, but this was important for me.
I'm wondering about this anarchist alternatives that you were proposing, because obviously, I mean, they sort of fall in line with whatever I said about weak versus heroic in all kinds of ways, right? So this refusal to take power is a crucial element of what I see as important in the weak resistant strategies. However, as I also said, I'm quite keen on counterpublics turning towards the making of institutions of the common, institutions for the people, whatever you would want to call it. But still, this institutional aspect is important for me as well. And I believe that this is, I mean, I'm not opening any new discussion here. I think it's quite an old-fashioned question. But somehow, to me, the anarchist proposal is fine as long as it follows. It is capable of creating institutional frameworks, right? And yeah, but from the perspective of the history of anarchism, this is extremely problematic because no anarchist would be happy to create any institutions whatsoever, right? So as long as these anarchist initiatives that you mentioned are willing to work towards the making of institutions, I would say institutions of the common, because I kind of genuinely like the concept of it, because they have the generality of the common and the kind of property format of the common, which is, as Negri describes it, the kind of third way between private property and state property, right? So creating the kind of alternative version of property would be, I think, solving a lot of problems that communists see and the left sees in the capitalist property organization and production and based on appropriation. Anyways, so this would work for me. So I would go for I would probably go for institutions in this effort of solving the problem, but also of trying to produce weak ways, so not non-authoritarian ways of building around not certain values but certain ways of production. So that would be my response to fascism, and this is, I think, the only genuine response to fascism. It's to organize in different ways. It's to organize desire, to organize vision, to organize education, to organize anything in an alternative way. And I think this is important, just as important as the, and I agree with you that the Enlightenment criticism of fascism is right. So I would agree that, I don't know, Adorno's critique of the mythical as coming back, as reinvigorated by the fascist politics, it seems credible still today. But I would correct it in one way. So I would correct it in a feminist way. I would say that Adorno's refusal to any emotional, affective responses to fascism and its crimes is a remnant of heroic masculinity, which I would like to get rid of. So, thank you.
No? Okay, I'm gonna, one little thing is that how do we, like this is, I think for me, interesting how to find new, like solidarity, alignments, and how do you find those people that you have an affinity with and start to build up, like, I don't know, like, in a way, I don't like to say new forms, but different forms of organization, and like, I think affinity is already enough. Like if you start to find those groups that you can communicate with and share some sort of political imagination with, and create those imaginaries that allow people to want to do something. And that's because this is something where I think that's kind of what the three of you also have in common, and it's maybe something that's possibly more hopeful, is how do how do you discard those old partners that have suddenly become fascists or smelly and find those other people that smell better?
You go? No, I think...
Mike?
So what we lack is like, we kind of lost the populist touch, right? I mean, I think like, in the sense that one thing, in the Popular Front, there was like the communist and socialist, socialist response to the rise of fascism, and also which fought, of course, the Spanish Civil War. What was important was like the radicalization of artists and technicians in producing new forms, public work arts and stuff. This is like art for the people, so to speak, but not by great contemporary art, nevertheless, not Soviet realism, I mean, right? I mean, so I think that what's notable, for example, in Great Britain is like how Corbyn speaks to the grime stars, how he uses popular culture to leverage like the millennials vote, like youth vote. We need a lot more of that, because in the end, togetherness is achieved also through the politics of not multitudinous, if not mass parties. Okay.
I agree with this anti-individualistic line that sort of, how to say, in which I think your speech was grounded. And I mean, in the country where I come from, liberalism was a sort of hugely important paradigm, has been hugely important. And it shaped our, but also if you look at the majority of the left-wing, supposedly left-wing agency in all senses, so theory, this kind of journalism, activism, etc., we are still deeply embedded in highly individualist thinking. And I think it really disturbs any resistance to fascism. Seriously, there is no possibility of opposing fascism, of building alternatives to it, if in the end we go back to our atomic sort of atomized realities that are completely deprived of any forms of, I don't know, community, commonality, etc. Also, I would like to emphasize this one thing that I'm sort of fetishizing a lot in the recent months, which is that the word the common, should be understood as both, as sort of perhaps collectivity or communion, yeah, but also as the ordinary, the daily, the how would call it again, kind of simple, yeah. That's the other meaning of it, and I think the simplicity. So this call to, I don't know, popular culture, social media, I agree with that, but also a sense of commonality that we are not doing anything exceptional, really. Opposing fascism. It's not.
The problem is workfare and welfare state.
Yeah.
No, the workfare. There is a tendency to like Gemeinschaft, to impose Gemeinschaft to people. I mean, I agree with you that. I mean, we have to occupy institutions and to exert power, build unions and parties and so on. But you know, when we are forcing people to work for peanuts. The workfare, the authoritarian element in this management of the crisis, I mean, people want freedom from that. I mean, at least we gotta grant them that.
Okay, thank you. I'm like, now we're really running out of time. Thank you so much. If we have a few minutes for questions or comments from the public. Do you have mic stands located here and here? You see they're also lit. So please make your way to a microphone if you have a question. And yeah, okay. Oh, I see Jeremy. Please, and please do keep in mind the time. Keep the questions short as possible.
Thanks. I'll try to be short. Thanks for your very interesting presentations. You seem to agree that, quote, digital revolution failed. But whether you think that revolution is permanent or that it's a matter of the historic conditions for it, it always takes a little bit of distance to look at these things. And now it looks to me like what failed, what we see failing, is technology with some characteristics of fascism, which are centralization, close down, exploitation of people and their data, and so on. Well, it's been since the early 80s that Richard Stallman and the Free Software Foundation actually spoke about that, and saw a future of technology that would be in the hands of the people, for the people, and a factor of emancipation. Of course, there are new questions today about decentralization, distribution of services, what we do with the hardware, and so on. I keep it short. Do you think still that free software, distributed technology, end-to-end encryption, and wondering about the hardware underlying still bears the potential for being the infrastructure to anti-fascism or to radical autonomous ways of getting out of this shit?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, but maybe it's maybe it's not on the level of infrastructure of anti-fascism, but infrastructure of decapitalism.
But if I can elaborate further, I think like the same technological conditions under fascism in the 30s produced war and genocide. Okay, then the same fucking assembly line was put to the service of social progress by, you know, huge communist, socialist, third world liberation movements. And it produced prosperity. Okay, you understand? The same technological paradigm in different institutional sense, in different, as I said in the book, regulation. So we are living the nasty bitter fruits of neoliberal deregulation, but a social re-regulation of informational capital could achieve prosperity and emancipation, in my view.
Okay, I see you over here on the right.
Hi. You have spoken about the term fascism and the designation the fascists in relation to a really broad range of movements and people. Now, considering that the term fascism is highly contested, I was wondering if you could specify a bit more what your understanding of the characteristics of fascism are in your analyses, and particularly also in what way these relate to historical and theoretical frameworks. So, what are the criteria to make something fascist? Is this about, for example, Junger's concept of a cult of violence for rebirth of the nation? Is this about authority and hierarchy as ultimate principle, etc., etc.? Or to put it more bluntly, is every person who is an outright activist necessarily a fascist? Is all nationalism fascism? Is everybody who is a pro-life activist a fascist? Because this has not become quite clear to me in the panel. Thank you.
Thank you for that question. It's obviously highly relevant, and personally, I just decided not to go there because it's such a broad discussion. I would say that it makes sense to maybe distinguish between, I mean, when we talk about fascist movements and fascism as a state of governance, so or like a political system, and also that more generally, I would say it's if we look at like political science today or political sociology and so on, too much effort is put into like deciding whether is this party fascist or not? Is this party fascist or not? What label to put on particular parties based on their like spoken programs? I would say that most of these, if we take parties as example, these European parties that can be called fascist or post-fascist or national populist or radical right-wing populist or whatever, they have none of them, almost none of them, is like clearly a fascist party, but all of them has fascist elements or tendencies or undercurrents or like driving movements beneath them. So they, I mean, and of course that's an analysis that tends more toward, slightly towards like Foucault's notion of microfascism, which I do think is relevant. but yeah, I think maybe a term like fascistization makes more sense sometimes.
I'll briefly respond to it because I think in my presentation I was quite specific about which elements of the Polish reality today on the political level, on the social level are fascist, so I'm not going to repeat this. I think it was there. And also, I must say I find this question a little bit troublesome because we are sitting here on a panel which is going towards its end. So we all know that we have, I don't know, 5-10 minutes. So asking a question as broad as that, on one hand, it definitely makes sense in a sense that we all want to define our notions that we use. But also it doesn't really give any of us, neither the panelists nor anybody here in this room, an opportunity to really express what fascism is. It's it's a huge problem. So I'm kind of giving it back to you, not in order to say that it was a bad question, because it was a good one. But I'm trying to, think in terms of, I don't know, discussion, its conditions, sort of empathy that we have towards each other, of asking this kind of questions that allow answering. Thank you very much.
Well,
Sorry, I'm sorry, you don't have a chance to respond. Okay. Alex is going to respond.
No, I mean, it was a fucking keen question to me, and I want to respond. I mean, historical fascism and national populism, I distinguish them because there is no Führer principle in Nazi populism, okay? So there is no Schmittian element. But so the continuity, and so what's clear and what's important for now, it's like the stress on national sovereignty. So whoever doesn't belong, whoever is not a national needs to be excluded. Is an alien, to be deported, tortured, whatnot, to be excluded from the national community. Oh man. So this why fascism is relevant again, okay? Because it's a process of exclusion. No, fascism is not simply nationalism, because conservative elites have always embraced it. It's the fusion between French nationalist ideology and Italian and French syndicalism, if you adhere to the idealist interpretation, or the process of petty bourgeois, especially government petty bourgeoisie, political mobilization. So Poulantzas, and especially Robert Paxton, who was my teacher at Columbia University, Anatomy of Fascism. Read that. Okay.
Yeah, I'm really sorry, we have to move on.
I think that gives you an answer to your many
thanks.
questions.
And thank you for your question. We're going to move to the last and final question, so I hope it's good.
I'll try to be quick. I would like to know your thoughts about when we hear like so-called fascist movements, talking, the enemy is this kind of liberal elites that live in the urban centers, and they claim to represent the needs of the population, like that is maybe in the periphery, like for example, Trump or the Rust Belt or things like that. I wanted to ask you about whether you see this kind of dichotomy or conflict between the urban and the periphery, and what is its role within this race of the new fascism?
That was a question between the urban and the periphery, yeah?
But fascism is rural. Fascism is rural. I mean, there is more, actually this and more in the sense it's the backwater. It's not metropolitan. This is actually a continuity between old and actually between Italian and German fascism. I mean, rural districts always outvoted, I mean, voted proportionally more for fascist forces, I mean, in this sense. I mean, clearly, neoliberalism was cosmopolitan, so like Saskia Sassen, it was made of global cities. I mean, this is really instead a reaction to that. It's like the provincials are back, and then they don't want the mixing we're used to. Berlin, like in the Weimar Republic, it was for Hugenberg and all the others, it was a provocation, an aberration, Babylon, sodomy, and so on and so forth. Okay.
Eva?
In Poland, we observe a very peculiar tendency, for scholars. Yeah? We are used to think, as you just said, rural areas, conservative, big cities, radical. It doesn't work like that in my country right now. And it's quite fantastic because in terms of, if we look at the gay rights, and that's a good example for it, a city of 100,000 inhabitants, Słupsk, chose 2 years ago in popular elections a gay president, a gay mayor of the city. And this guy is very successfully running the city. He's extremely popular. Now he is third, if the presidential election for the whole country were now, he would be the candidate with the third position in terms of polls, etc. Yeah? So the little city of Słupsk has shown us how to proceed in a progressive way. This guy is also a left-wing politician. So also in small villages, you get lesbian women to be chosen to be like the chiefs of the village every now and then. So we have this kind of tendencies which completely contradict the historical scenario. So now the question is, I think, well, in my research and in my also political work, I'm working quite a bit on trying to build a larger picture of these little moments of complete reversal of anything that we've known about periphery and center until now. So thank you for the question.
Yes, thank you. I think it's not so easy to answer that question because, if I repeat, I think we should distinguish between maybe three senses of fascism. It's fascism as a movement, fascism as an ideology or Weltanschauung, and fascism as a political system. Yeah. And this question, I guess, relates to fascism as a movement. And then I would just say that fascism as a movement, historically and contemporary, tends to be an alliance. Fascism is some kind of alliance, not simply a class alliance, probably that as well, but it's also alliance between different kinds of forces. Just like we see in the alt-right today, it's been written numerous accounts on the very different forces running together and finding themselves in the Trump campaign. Also historically, if we take Italian fascism, for example, it was an alliance with different kinds of forces, including both very urban and very rural forces. Yeah, thank you.
I think we're going to have to end this panel. I want to thank our speakers, so Rasmus Fleischer, Eva Majewska, and Alex Foti. Again, I want to thank Transmediale for hosting this discussion because, as you can see, it's a huge topic. It needs a lot more discussion. Please continue this over your breakfast, your lunch, your dinner, and your drinks. Please leave it off of the dance floor.